Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze. This week in Davos, Switzerland. Hi, Adam.
Okay.
So we have one data point for you all. That is 70, as in 70 minutes. That was the approximate duration of Donald Trump's speech at Davos, at the World Economic Forum at Davos this week. That speech was scheduled for 45 minutes. It ran long. That's not unusual for a Trump speech. What was unusual was the audience. This wasn't just a captive press corps. It was the world's political and corporate elite that gathers every year at Davos, at least those with the badges sufficiently powerful enough to get in the room to be his audience. And yeah, being in that audience was kind of some status signaling. I'm sure that's part of the Davos experience that we've discussed before on this podcast. But it was also an expression of the kind of the history making, or at least the market making, that was at stake in Trump's performance. It seems like the entire week was kind of held captive to the Trump administration's challenge, not only to the transatlantic alliance, but to the general ideology behind the annual Davos meeting, the ideology of liberal globalism that we've discussed also before, and that used to not be controversial on its own terms at these Davos meetings, but this week, rather than an expression of confidence, the conference seemed to be sort of preoccupied with the future of the ideology itself, and whether it was being ruptured entirely, to use the pointed word from Mark Carney's, that's Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, his speech at the conference. Adam, of course, as I mentioned, you are at the conference. You've been there all week. You've been very busy. And so, before anything else, I just want to ask you about the atmosphere in Davos. What have you been seeing? What have you been hearing? What have you been observing? How does it contrast to previous editions of Davos that you've been at?
I've done a few of them, and this was by far the most tense. I started going in the first Trump period, and this hasn't been anything like anything I've experienced before. I mean, in part because Davos, though it is the World Economic Forum, is a distinctly European event. And the two singular Davoses in that respect were the one in May 2022 after COVID, which was dominated by Ukraine, to the point where I think we've spoken about this before actually on the show. Non-European delegates were, I think, quite put off. And this one was different because globalism aside, which we should come back to, we started the week with the United States refusing to rule out the possibility of the use of armed force
Mm.
to infringe on the sovereignty of a European country, a fellow NATO member, a member of the EU, and threatening, unless its demands were met, and the demands of the Trump administration was met, to impose punitive sanctions that breach an agreement that was reached over the summer, which many of us, and we just talked about this on the show, regarded as a humiliating climb down by the Europeans in the face of Trump's demands. And so the first couple of days of the meeting, Monday, Tuesday, in fact, the weekend I was in Berlin, like we were together in Berlin over the weekend. The mood in Europe was one of uproar. Forget globalization, that wasn't really the issue. It was simply, where does the North Atlantic Alliance stand?
Mm.
Within which then the question of globalization takes on a different aspect. Um, but that was the central issue. And I mean, of course, in a kind of, we'll talk more about it, I'm sure, but like in a kind of classic Trumpian climb down, it all just turned out to be not really what any reasonable person would have construed it as being. But just to underline the point about globalization, I mean, Davos, though it is a very European event, and this time was dominated by the family or the intra-North Atlantic dispute between the US, Canada, Europeans, is a dramatically global event. And no one in their right mind would pose the question as to whether or not the world economy continues to develop in a multipolar or globalized way. I mean, no one else is really posing this question in the way that the Americans under Trump oh, this isn't like the administration, which managed to pose similar questions in a way which actually did take other people along with it. This hasn't had that effect at all. Like, no, there's no doubt that, ASEAN or China or Australia or even the Canadians, Mark Carney came to Davos from China, Starmer's going to China. Um, Mertz was going on about how he'd been in China. Um, the only people who are truly trying to rewrite the script are the Trump administration, and they only impose themselves because of America's structural power and because of the sheer brutish bullying nature of the Trump administration, its appearance at the conference.
Yeah, that seems apparent. In other words, that the United States is not a marginal actor here, and that Trump's speech then de facto is becomes the kind of centerpiece of this conference, even as it's inherently challenging some of the kind of basic premises of the conference itself. So I'm curious, were you able to hear the speech in person? I mean, and what is the reaction of other global leaders, elites of various kinds, to a speech of the kind that Trump delivered? Obviously, it was unstable in all the sorts of ways that his speeches tend to be. And how does the global elite um, respond to that, or accommodate it, or yeah, process that?
I mean, I frankly would not
Mm,
go to see a Trump speech of my own free will. Added to which, I mean, I thought the behavior of the vast majority of the delegates at the conference was like totally, I mean, extraordinarily undignified, to be honest. I mean, in light of the fact that everyone, the vast majority of people there are profoundly at odds with this person's message and his manner and regard it as offensive and stupid. The vast majority of people engaged in like a scrum-like surge to get into the main hall, and I just don't, I don't understand that. The appropriate response to the president's appearance should have been an empty room. He should have been talking to his own people. And I don't know why anyone went. I only listened to it because I promised a journalist that I would answer questions about it for Chinese television immediately afterwards. And so I had felt I had to be briefed and understand what was going on. And it's the first Trump speech I've listened to from beginning to end. And it was a kind of nightmarish experience of like, it's the classic experience of things just don't make sense anymore. So, you try and follow a sentence, and for, as you were saying, for 70 minutes, it's just this undigested vomit of stuff. It's not a word salad. Salad's far too precious. Like this is just garbage. So, so that's one of the ambiguities of this event is that the people go. It's not political enough. Like I mean, I watched with a disaffected bunch of global journalists who sat in the lounge and saw it on TV and just kind of laughed and giggled with each other until we got really really dispirited, and then we started talking about crazy battleships. The hilarious moments was like giggling with Chinese colleagues around the windmill, these ridiculous things about Chinese wind turbines being a Potemkin village. I mean, you couldn't stop laughing at that point. And then as it went on and it went on, and the reality sank in that this is the Prime President of the United States, and whether he's lost his marbles, he may never have had any in the first place. But like, it was after my experience with how it looked like the day before.
mm,
It was about as much of this version of America as I can take, to be honest. Um, yeah, it was difficult to digest. And I mean, Lutnick's a different case altogether because he's just a really quite streamlined powerhouse bully character who will deliver the 2.5 minute version or the 3 or 4 minute version of MAGA's message quite effectively. He's quite eloquent when he gets going. And he
mm.
just flat out said on the panel, we disagree. We are against everything. I mean, they're invited, like they use the stage and then just flat out denounce it. I mean, it's it's
Mm.
yeah, it's an experience I will be digesting for some time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I do think the impulse to laugh at Trump is entirely understandable. In in some ways it reminds me that I think in his first term that was the literal response sometimes to speeches he
Yep.
gave. But I
Yeah.
don't think it's any longer
Yeah.
a response that's afforded to his audiences anymore. Um, and in that sense, I guess I can understand why people want to listen. It is one is obliged to. The very
Well, we
fact.
listened. Yeah, I just
Yeah.
don't think you should be in his audience. I mean,
Mm-mm.
we have to know. I mean, I had to know. One has to know. I mean, and after all, in the speech, he did say something significant, or something we take to be significant, though it's unclear which bit of world geography it applied to. But he seemed to be saying that he was unlikely to use military force against either Greenland, or maybe it was Iceland, or maybe it was Denmark. But in any case, the words that he said were that, there wasn't going to be the military attack, which is what was really preoccupying the European political elite. And so
Yeah.
it was worth, it was worth listening in. And apparently that wasn't in the script. So his script writers had written him
Huh.
a speech which left that in suspense, which gives you an idea of like the sort of people that work around the Trump administration. They had left all of that out. He wasn't supposed to talk about Greenland. He made a joking about it as as he said, for the concession to the audience. And the speech he'd actually had written was all about domestic policy because they're obviously anxious about the midterms and the fact the president appears to care about a whole bunch of other things far more than the actual situation of ordinary Americans. And so there was this sort of deranged central passage bracketed on either end by standard boosterism about the US economy and gestures to, drug prices, that whole rambling, bizarre thing about his conversations with Macron, housing costs, credit cards, which was the kind of effort to package Trump as a bona fide populist.
Yeah, increasingly, I do think like the Wilhelm II analogy is actually underexplored. The last Kaiser of Imperial Germany, who was a very unstable, narcissistic personality himself, and increasingly, I sort of want to go back and look at the international crises, even preceding World War One, that Wilhelm triggered. And it's actually sort of worth seeing how other international actors respond to this kind of personality. And again, where laughing is just simply not really an option. But yeah, crisis becomes the inevitable result. But regardless, as Trump aside, uh, the Trump administration was represented by various other figures, including you mentioned Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary.
Everyone, I think.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much.
Rubio,
Yeah.
I think literally everyone. Yeah.
And these are, obviously in traditional ways more capable policy and political figures than Trump himself, according to traditional measures. And yet, rather than the kind of offering constraints to Trump's worldview, there seemed to be a sort of general effort to channel Trump's impulses into a consistent policy line. And the way that sort of came across to me, observing it from afar, is just a kind of general, consistent contempt that was being expressed for Europe in public by these various officials at every opportunity. I mean, like Besant's various quotes basically instructing Europe not to retaliate, suggesting that it doesn't matter. Lutnick in the ways you were just describing. I mean, obviously, there seems to be this is more than just a coincidence. It seems to be a broader strategy that's informing this posture. And again, leaving Trump's impulses aside, what do you sense is the kind of broader posture that the United States was taking here?
Yeah, condescension, I think, is a key element of it. Hostility and condescension. I mean, I think we've talked about it on the show before. I mean, my general view is that the more ideological elements of MAGA are much more preoccupied with Europe than they are with China or Russia or anywhere else in the world because they don't regard, they're not universalist, so they don't regard those places as at all relevant really to the American political struggle, which is their top priority. But quite reasonably, they regard Europe as an extension of the PMC, professional managerial class, liberal elitism. What is it? Elitism. I mean, liberalism that they despise in the United States. And as you were saying, the first time round, and it's if you look at the climate policy, which I'm trying to finish this book about, like it's very clear in 2017, as Trump took office, America's climate concerned liberal corporate elites basically rallied around the Paris Agreement of 2015 and Davos and continued on in defiance of the president's effort to shape a national MAGA anti-climate strategy. And so they're not wrong to think that, if they want to wage a comprehensive political and cultural struggle in the United States, Europe is a relevant battlefield. Um, and the precise logic of it is a little more complicated, especially when it comes to promoting far right parties in Europe, who over Greenland, Ivan Krastev and I did a conversation. He vividly described how if you watch the sort of C-SPAN equivalent of the European Parliament, centrist parties all go up to say, no, we will not ratify the trade agreement with the United States. And then slowly, 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 the representatives of the far right parties realize, oh God, we're going to find ourselves isolated and unpatriotic unless we join the opposition to Trump. And many of them do. So Meloni has been struggling with this in Italy, how to position herself. So I think that element of the MAGA program of like extending the political and cultural war to Europe is a key element. But again, we shouldn't like the national security strategy did not focus squarely on Greenland in the way that we have been forced to do in the last couple of months. It didn't say jeopardize relations with Europe for the sake of Greenland, right? Something's happened there where the president has got a bee in his bonnet. And as you're saying, the single rule of membership in the Trump government seems to be just complete loyalty to whatever nonsense the president says. Like whatever he says goes. And when you push people like Lucknow and Besant on broader issues, they basically just hand it off. That's not my bag. So there's no sense of like classic cabinet responsibility for the salient issues of the day, even when in this joined up way that Stephen Mirren has taught them to think about American power, they are using trade protectionism as a weapon to pursue the president's whims over, Greenland. So so I don't think we should, the hostility to Europe is real. The hostility to European liberalism is absolutely real and abiding. I think what we particularly saw this week was, these people who were desperate to deliver on the president's demands, facing quite concerted pushback from the Europeans and basically just saying, get lost, get out of the way. Besant's phrase was something like, let nature take its course. Like,
Yeah.
what type of nature does he exactly have in mind? Like big bad wolf Trump eats little Denmark or something? Like it's beyond comprehension at times. And the closer up, I have to say, like realism in international relations coming at you in a room, it's this is obviously not the same as being invaded in the Ukraine, but all of a sudden it takes on a violence and a force that is of a different order. These aren't light chats.
Yeah, there is something, I mean, there is something gratuitous about it. And that seems to me part of the logic of it. And in other words,
Demonstrative. Yeah.
in other words, one can't be contemptuous or condescending uh, without imagining there will be some response to that, right? I mean, in other words, and I wonder in private how all these various other elites respond to this kind of condescension. I mean, like there must be a kind of backlash that's sort of that is precisely inherent to the logic of it. I mean, it seems like, and that I guess is the overall question I have about the strategy, from the U.S. perspective, which is this kind of it's a strange ceding of power as the same time it's expressing power. There's a strange like
Mm.
but 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 yeah, it is interesting to hear sort of behind the scenes that I read that Lagarde left, sort of got up and left a dinner where Letnick was speaking. Didn't surprise me. In other words, it seems like this is the logical endpoint of how these kinds of interactions would go. And yet then in
Mm.
public, I think most people took a more temperate stand in public. And one exception was the kind of speech by Mark Carney that I mentioned at the outset, in which he very bracingly described the rupture of the old liberal order that was underway. Um, and I think a lot of people took note of that. But I was curious about your thoughts about what he was prescribing. In other words, for middle powers, as these other great powers he's describing are taking this realist posture. Uh, what exactly did he think middle powers should be doing? Because it struck me that in some sense he was arguing that they should continue pursuing liberalism with one another, just I guess from some new, less naive vantage point. I mean, is that what he was basically sketching as a plan going forward?
I mean, I think this goes back. I mean, I did a newsletter about it. I think this goes back to Mark Carney's thinking about the monetary system in the 2010s. In the first Trump administration, he was governor of the Bank of England. And he gave a very interesting paper at Jackson Hole in 2019, the big central banking conference, in which he outlined a future for the global monetary system, in which, over the long run at least, then, and this is where I think the transition phrase comes in, Carney's in a sense referring to his own previous thought, that in 2019 he was talking about a long range transition to a multipolar, more balanced financial and monetary system to match the realities of the multipolar economy, the real economy. And now what he's saying is it's happening much more dramatically, and it's happening not just in the economic sphere, but in all of these other dimensions. And so we're dealing with a rupture. And I'm profoundly in sympathy with the way in which he articulated at the conference the visceral shock of dealing with the Trump thugs. I mean, it's different. It's qualitatively different. Um, what he's aiming for me, I think actually the final part of the speech, people should check it out or look at the newsletter where I've discussed it. Like I'm sure for FP we'll be covering it in lots of different versions. The final passage to me is like very straightforward. It's not liberalism in general, but liberalism with whom you can do liberalism. Like so pick your partners, and obviously the Europeans will be one sort of partner that you might be able to do that with, or the Japanese, for instance, or the Australians. Latin America. Um, but Carney demonstratively went to Beijing and did a deal with them. And if you read the speech, what he says is right now the priority for middle powers should not be the kind of deep values-based arrangements. So it's a move. This is what he's giving up, right? The exclusive focus on deep value-based arrangements is what we cannot any longer assume is going to be the norm. A certain one that can't generalize. So in the absence of that, what we have to be willing to do is much broader, thinner deals with countries with whom one doesn't necessarily have values agreement on issues, however, on which one can agree. And that's what the trip to China was supposed to demonstrate. And the Brits are following up. Starmer, who wasn't at Davos, will be going to Beijing by all accounts. I think pursuing something quite similar. So one of the elements of substance is precisely sacrificing a consistent, coherent, all-embracing, universal commitment to thick agreement at all levels, instead in favor of a mix and match approach where with those with whom you have deep agreement, you do deep bargains, and with those with whom you don't, you settle for something less. Implicitly, of course, that also leaves room for dealing with a MAGA in the United States, which ought to be treated by rights as a pariah, but obviously if you're Canada, you can't. So what do? You do the kind of arrangements that you can make work with the United States. But let's stop pretending, certainly in its current incarnation, well, I think in general, one have to say that American democracy is a reliable partner for any kind of sophisticated modern international deal, because the Obama administration and the Biden administration were, but that's the whole point of democracy. And given America's polarization right now, one has to take that absolutely seriously. And the Trump administration is demonstrating quite how seriously one has to take it. So that's what I think the import of Carney's message is that the assumption of universality, of convergence, of deep convergence is dead. So instead, what we do is we look around realistically at those with whom one can reach that kind of agreement, and with others moves to a more minimal kind of conception, but potentially much more embracing, because you're not going to wait around as the Biden administration would want for Canada to agree a policy with the United States on China. If that's the neuralgic issue of the current moment, that's done. Like the effort by the Biden administration early on in 2021 to rally all of the democracies against China, America no longer serves as an effective anchor for that kind of alliance building.
Yeah, it is interesting. I wonder in that case what is also like the source of historical confidence for liberalism or those liberal powers, when you no longer have the universalism to draw on. And it seems like, the other sort of confident great actors have their great powers, have their, power that's self-justifying in some way. And I wonder how the liberal project as this kind of, non-universalist idea fares in struggles for competition.
Don't you think it's? I kind of feel it's stronger. I mean, it just demonstrates success. Like, do Chinese people want to move to Canada? How many Canadians want to move to China? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a pretty straight answer. Like,
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
the
Um,
Chinese love, having a second home in China. Like, I end the story. Like, that's your confidence.
mm,
Uh, what is one of China's great claims to leadership in the world today? It's technology. Where does
mm,
that inspiration come from? It wasn't China. It was Europe and transatlantic liberalism that generated that, and it's German subsidies which opened the market for China's solar and wind. This is in no way I cannot be accused of underplaying the triumph of China's subsequent development, but if I was Europe, I would be saying this
mm,
is astonishing. Like this in China, which is radically different from ours in so many ways, is beholden to Marxism, which, after all, is a offshoot of the Enlightenment, the standard Eric Hobsbawm argument. And the second, more urgently and more relevant and more immediate, is that, and if you speak to Chinese technicians about this, as I did, I had the privilege. One of the better moments of the conference was having dinner with the there's like a Chinese dinner, Latin American dinner, and I was invited to be at the Chinese dinner, and every Longi, BYD, all these companies know that the DNA of Chinese industrialism in its modern form has a very, very large component of Europe in it, in the same way as Chinese tech has a huge component of the United States in it. And they don't have any problem with this. They totally own this. Like they embrace it. They are deeply respectful. Many of them trained in the West, totally embrace it. Have no problem in denying. And for them, of course, it's a universalism. That's one of the absolute baselines. So, and and
mm.
and they immediately and wholeheartedly recognize it as a Western achievement, which China has subsequently appropriated and dynamized and turned in its own direction and made its own. So I don't think there's any reason for liberal bashfulness. Like,
Mm.
I mean, it's just the sort of rather simplistic version of that universalism, which the limits of which are just being exposed, right? And they will, after all, Europe is not safe from the we've discussed this many times, right? The dominant surge in European politics right now, the absurd is from the right. The absurdity, one of the absurdities of the Trump of the Trumpian formulation of the transatlantic difference is that they make Europe into this thing which I would perhaps love it to be, but and you would certainly as well, but like it is not. Um,
Yeah. That is a useful a reminder, and yeah, the thought that the sort of to whatever extent Europe is in a malaise, that it is a self-imposed in some ways, then it can overcome it, is a useful reminder. But yeah, I guess to shift from this kind of like overall general cultural question to the policy question of resisting coercion from the United States, because that's what was
yeah.
at stake this week. I wonder, yeah, what options Europe has for resisting coercion of the kind the United States was was clearly willing to at least entertain the idea of economic coercion in the form of tariffs, military coercion in the
Mm.
form at least of an invasion. There was talk of Europe's anti-coercion instrument that it has developed. Is that a realistic option that could have been deployed here, and would that have been effective?
Yeah, I mean, we're recording on Thursday night, and the Europeans are meeting in an emergency session this evening. And it's quite clear that if they hadn't gotten the deal that they seem to have arrived at, there was every chance that they would be discussing the triggering of the anti-coercion mechanisms against the US. And the problem with Trump is you never know what to take seriously. He hadn't, after all, actually imposed the tariffs or sent troops. He just talked about it in a completely irresponsible way. And his entire team said, oh, yes, you've got to take this all terribly seriously. So everyone did because they're responsible people. But I think, yes, I think the anti-coercion, which is basically targeted sanctions and targeted tariffs in the first instance, and then much more aggressively, essentially coercive sanctions against American corporate interests in Europe. So that would be basically the removal of the operational, the license to operate of American firms in Europe, which will be drastic. And as Macron said in his speech, it would be crazy, I think that was his word, if this instrument, which was developed by Europe with China and Russia in mind, was in fact to be first used against the US. Beyond that, I mean, the Europeans put troops in Greenland, obviously in a kind of like trigger. The problem, of course, like a tripwire kind of way. Of course, the Europeans don't have much to back up the tripwire with, but the idea was to make it unthinkable for the Americans to use force because they would be shooting at fellow NATO members potentially. So that couldn't happen. And then down the line, there's all sorts of other kind of talk about other instruments Europe might use because the long-standing economic connection and independence has, of course, created vast arrays of assets that could be used by both
Mm.
sides potentially. Europe is a huge foreign investor in the United States, and the Europeans buy very large quantities of more liquid assets, financial assets as well from America, which is how America finances its chronic trade deficits with Europe. And all of those give Europe a degree of leverage.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk this week about a Deutsche Bank report that was issued to its private research clients that described the option, apparently a realistic option of Europe selling its treasuries, its T-bills, as a kind of retaliation to coercion from the United States over Greenland. Scott Bessent apparently spoke with the head of Deutsche Bank and and said afterwards that the Deutsche Bank disowned this report, although it was a research report that didn't come from the kind of banking operation itself. Um, that seemed to me a sort of expression of some kind of fear on Bessent's part, and I'm curious how seriously this Deutsche Bank report should be taken as a potential measure that Europe could take.
I mean, I have to say, I didn't focus mainly on European events this week, but I was at one meeting this afternoon. This is Thursday afternoon, a very high level meeting, including several heads of government and foreign ministers and two of the policy banks. And this issue came up, and no one wanted to talk about it. So it was floated by the chair, and it just no one wants to talk about it. I mean, there are three things to say, I think, at least. I mean, first of all, unlike China, the vast majority of European holdings are not any kind of centralized reserve. So, a bit like, the absurdity of the European negotiations with Trump over LNG purchases. There's no there, right? There's no European agency which controls these and could turn them into a lever of power, unlike in China, where we think even those which aren't held by the official agencies could be instrumentalized and are probably currently being instrumentalized to hide how large China's holdings are because it's unpopular in China for the central government, the SAFE, the Asset Management Fund, to actually hold too many American treasuries. So, and they also want to obscure how big their surplus is. So, that doesn't exist. B, the one instance where so-called bear raid on U.S. treasuries was actually unleashed is in 2007-8 by Putin, by the Russians, after the Munich Security Conference into 2008, running up to the crisis over Georgia, with the Americans seemingly on the ropes because of the financial crisis. Putin, by all accounts, and this is authenticated from several different sources, attempted to persuade the Chinese to join him in selling treasuries. The Russians did run down a large part of their foreign exchange reserve held in treasuries, and it made zero impact because at the time the banking crisis was happening and people run into public debt because it's safe, and so there were people snapping up the treasuries the Russians were selling. So it didn't work. Imagine if it did work. In the extraordinarily unlikely event that Europe would go there, it would be, costly, expensive, and dangerous. Um, and the Americans have ways of coping with it because during the 2020 financial crisis around COVID, which was a treasury-centered market of crisis, not a bank-centered crisis, what the Fed simply does is step in and buy the
Yeah.
treasuries that are being sold by reserve managers. And there's no question at all that if the Trump administration was confronted by a concerted European effort, it would just buy them. So it would be dangerous, very alarming. It's been tried before and it didn't work, and the instruments that are available to make it work in Europe don't seem to provide the kind of tools that you'd be looking for. So I think this is idea that America is vulnerable because it has these large outstanding treasury foreign holdings of treasuries, circulates through the debate over and over again. And of course, in general, it is a kind of vulnerability. But whenever anyone thinks about how to concretely weaponize it, it tends to sort of dissolve in people's, the argument can't really ever be made to work very well. But it's typical of the Trump administration that they would haul in Deutsche Bank and like spank
Huh.
them.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess this raises for me the question of the broader um, posture that private sector representatives in Davos took this week. Obviously, policymakers were concerned and were considering contingency plans, including pretty extreme measures of the kinds we're just talking about. But what do the corporate elites, the private sector representatives say about the rupture of transatlanticism? I mean, are they as concerned as the policymakers we've been talking about?
So it's like two. It's a very, very. It was a very ambiguous experience. I did not hear either on or off the record a single senior American business leader distance themselves from the aggression of the Greenland policy and the insanity of the Trump speech. Remember, like we met like days after the mad Trump letter to the Norwegian Prime Minister. I mean, truly like demonstration of a kind of infantilism. And yet no one would touch it. And no one in none of in no meeting, and I won't go into too many details because but I at no point heard anyone in the American corporate world willing to distance themselves from what was going on.
Hmm.
But at the top level, what was really fascinating was to see the role of um, BlackRock, because BlackRock was anchoring the whole show. Sorry, I'm having like a blank. What's the gosh? I'm really exhausted. The CEO of BlackRock,
Larry Fink is
Larry
the
Fink.
yeah.
So Larry Fink, in the after the crisis of the WEF, in Klaus Schwab's leadership, took temporary leadership of the organization and used his weight to persuade. I mean, Larry, BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world, $14 trillion worth of assets, giant player, post-bank finance era, to persuade um, all of corporate America to come, or at least consider coming. The tech people, Elon Musk showed up this afternoon. Jamie Dimon, the old banking elite, Ken Griffin, the new private equity hedge fund elite, were all there to provide like an extraordinary platform of authority. And yet, when it came down to it, it was the politicians who had actually to do all of the work because the conflict of interest is so intense for the corporates, given the willingness of MAGA to single companies out. You know, they've excluded Bank of America from, you know, prestigious invitations to Davos parties. They, they're willing to target people they think are on their shit list. And no one in corporate America, or
Huh.
indeed, as far as I can see, globally, is willing to really distance themselves. So on the one hand, you have this huge convening power, which matters, but on the other hand, it's a kind of it's like you're pushing on a piece of string, or paper tiger is perhaps too strong a word, but nevertheless, it doesn't, at least publicly, it doesn't have much weight. My sense is that it did matter behind the scenes. You couldn't very well deny the seriousness, and for all the obstreperousness and cantankerousness and protesting of the Trump people, after all, they chose to come, unlike in the Biden administration. I don't think, did Biden ever go? I don't think he ever did. Um, and and on the other hand, that then in turn provided the platform for the European politicians and a bunch. There were several congressional representatives, both House and governors and senators, to work on the Americans over the Greenland issue. And so it wasn't capital directly, but it was capital providing the kind of platform around which then the Trump administration sort of had to come to play. And then, of course, with the Global Peace Initiative, the, you know, Trump's great global golf club of cronies, um, to actually use Davos in a way that I don't think anyone can remember, to essentially take over the stage and stage a Trump fest within the forum's meeting.
Huh.
So it was a sort of strange kind of, and one of the ways in which they avoided confrontation was to come up with another hot topic that wasn't geopolitics, and that was AI. And so I was on this bizarre panel with Fink and Ken Griffin and Christine Lagarde, notionally about the 1920s, in which there were two different versions of the 1920s to be discussed. Lagarde and I thought we were going to talk about, she'd done a paper, you know, her team had written a paper for her on, you know, reparations and the gold standard and the Dawes Plan and the Great Depression. And the Americans thought we were going to talk about tech booms in the 1920s and their perils. So because that's safe, that's not political. You can talk about that. That's safe. What you can't really talk about is tariffs and the gold standard and the failure of American hegemony, which of course is the story of the 1920s. So it's been fascinating to watch. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I would say I guess I would say that I don't see a necessary contradiction or incoherence there from the perspective of these corporate elites in the sense that yeah, I guess for those in the Roaring Twenties, Weimar Germany was not immediately maybe relevant for them, and I guess
no, on the contrary, American money pours into the Weimar Republic.
I
IG
guess maybe,
Farben and Vereinigte Stahlwerke, they're all backed by Wall Street money. The whole point of the Weimar Republic's strategy was to borrow so much money from the United States that they were too big to fail. Like
but
the,
the
I,
yeah, I
but
guess
there's no, and I agree, at a historical level, there's no, you can have both the American tech story and the bubble story and the Florida real estate. Barry Eichengreen did a great book in these terms. That's not my point. Intellectually, you can put the two things together. It just turned out that's not what was on their mind. Like, so
yeah.
it was like a shock. Like Andrew Sorkin, the New York Times bestseller, he's done this book about 29. That's what they thought they were going to talk about, and like somehow going to rabbit on about excessive spending, which is of course not the history of the 1920s. So it was this garbled thing. But the crucial point is that it just wasn't any of the delicate stuff. So what I'm trying to answer is like, where is American business on this? Which is they they understand they somehow need to convene. They understand there is a hot potato here, but none of them actually wants to touch it. And they will literally arrange for themselves a version of history such that even when you're talking about a manifest moment of American hegemonic failure, that's not what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, that is the compartmentalization at work there is
Yeah.
is
Behind the
fascinating.
scenes, God knows what's going on. No way of knowing, right? And Besant was putting a front on it and saying, the stock market sell-off was all down to Japan. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if people behind the scenes were telling him something quite different. But
But
in public, no one's gonna break
well, this is also why
ranks.
we should not have our corporate leaders um, be our political leaders necessarily. If yeah, because we can have this sort of transition from one order to another geopolitical order, and as
Yeah.
long as I guess everything is the trade is still happening in the background, they're not compelled to say anything. Why would they need to?
Well,
Um,
that's a universalism that really has broken down. Like, because once a strong version of universalism would have said it's absolutely necessary to have the full global package for us to prosper and thrive. And we're not in that world right now.
Mhm.
There's a whole
Yeah,
bunch of players who clearly think back Trump, that's the way to go.
I guess this raises the question, and maybe this is a good way to end the conversation about where all of this leaves Davos and the World Economic Forum. As the Trump administration was de facto announcing the end of this ideology, that in the ways we've been talking about, the end of this era of globalization. That seems to me part of the point of their presence. So yeah, what role does Davos still have to play? Where did the figures at Davos find themselves grasping for a way forward here?
But I mean, this is part of the paradox, right? I think in living memory, there may not have been a more, one that attracted more attention than this one. Um, because, one way of reading it is that they backed away from a crazy trade slash maybe even another type of war over Greenland here this week. So, and to re-emphasize, no one other than the Americans is talking about the end of globalization in the way the Trump people. Really, that's just an American conversation. It's and no one else is. It's nonsense. So no, I mean, I think I mean, and shout out to. I mean, I've been doing these long enough to be friendly with people who, whose job it is to make these things happen. Many of them are in total shell shock because it's been brutal dealing with the discourteousness and just horror of the Trump team. Not everyone, there's some notable exceptions, no need to name names, but it's the case. But in general, it's been brutish and not short. Um, but I think one thing is very clear, which is that having it run by even the most powerful, comprehensive agency of American finance creates conflicts of interest, which are really difficult to handle. And Christine Lagarde is the person most widely thought to be in line to succeed. And in many ways, she would make a very obvious kind of figure manager of the process. She obviously has strong views about the way in which these sorts of conversations should be conducted. It's very clear, I think, that a kind of merger of the organization with American capital doesn't work. It
Hmm.
doesn't really work I think it's exposed BlackRock to some risks they're probably not at all comfortable with politically. And it doesn't work in terms of the logic of convening. And there were quite a lot of Swiss people talking to me and saying none of this would have happened in the old eras of Klaus Schwab. This would never have been handed over. It would have been more autonomous.
Hmm.
I'm not going to indulge in that kind of nostalgia, but I think structurally it's pretty obvious why even the Americans might want not one of them to have to actually, make some of the tough decisions um, that are necessary. So it's been fascinating to watch as a learning process.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's clearly not the end of Davos, but maybe the end of a certain kind of
Davos
Davos.
1.0, you might say. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I guess, but and the start of a new one. Yeah, I mean, it's they say in German, nach dem Spiel ist vor dem Spiel. After
After
Davos is
the
yeah,
yeah.
after the Davos is before the next Davos. So we're in the transition of Davos, if not the world order. And yeah, I'm sure we will talk about Davos in a year from now. But for now. Safe travels to you, Adam, and we will otherwise be back with everyone next week.